Welcome to Joseph and His Brothers, part of the Biblical Reflection series of courses we've been doing over the past few years. This will be the last week of the story of Joseph and his brothers. I'll eventually be sending out an email as far as what the next biblical story we'll be tackling on our Wednesday evening classes will be. But for now, this will mark the conclusion of the fascinating story of Joseph and his brothers. We've been studying this now for a few months, this being the last segment of this particular series. I want to put Act 10 up on the screen again. We started it last week. We'll continue it with it this week, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to put the text up. We'll read it through it quickly because we already read it last week, but it'll set the scene for you for our discussion of this evening. Now Joseph could not bear all those standing beside him, and he called out, "Take everyone away from me." So no one stood with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept out loud, so the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him because they were startled by his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they drew closer. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not be sad, and let it not trouble you that you sold me here, for it was to preserve life that God sent me before you. For already 2 years of famine have passed in the midst of the land, and for another 5 years there will neither be plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to make for you a remnant in the land, and to preserve it for your great deliverance. And now you did not send me here, but God. And he made me a father to Pharaoh, a lord over all of his household, and a ruler over the entire land of Egypt. Hasten and go up to my father, and say to him, 'So said your son Joseph, God has made me a lord over all the Egyptians. Come down to me, do not tarry, and you shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children and your grandchildren, and your flocks and your cattle and all that is yours. And I will sustain you there, for there are still 5 years of famine, lest you become impoverished, you and your household and all that is yours. And behold, your eyes see, as well as the eyes of my brother Benjamin, that it is my mouth speaking to you. And you shall tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and all that you have seen, and you shall hasten and bring my father down here." And he fell on his brother's Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. That's the powerful verses of the reunion of Joseph and his brothers, which we started delving into last week, and will continue now on the power of that reunion and what it must have felt to be one of the brothers of Joseph in the room at that particular time. Certainly, this was a very emotional time for all of them, especially for Joseph. And the commentaries delve into how much bitterness and resentment an ordinary man would harbor in his heart if he went through what Joseph went through. Now, one would have expected, and rightfully so, that Joseph would have been so angry that he could never forgive his brothers. I mean, think, his siblings tried to kill him for no reason. And then they sold him into captivity. They sold him as a slave, again, for no reason, no justification. And they abandoned him for the rest of his life. You can imagine the hours of therapy that any of us would need to go through to just cope with one day of life if that happened to us. What did Joseph do with this? How did Joseph deal with this? How did Joseph go on? So when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, in the chapter we just read together, we didn't find rage, right? We didn't find revenge. He doesn't say, "And now you're going to be slaves to me because of what you did to me." Instead, the opposite. We find him calming his mortified brothers. They're the ones that are now feeling the brunt of it. They're feeling the guilt, and he's calming them. Do not be distressed, he says to his brothers. Joseph is the one that should have been livid. His brothers should have been soothing him. And instead, we find him calming his brothers. They should be the ones begging for forgiveness, beseeching him to atone for their act. Instead, Joseph is the calm voice of that chapter, telling them not to be distressed. It's ironic because the perpetrators here have become the victims. They're the ones feeling sad and miserable, and the victim is the one that's soothing the guilty ones. Now, someone just reading that chapter without the prior verses would say, you know what? He's just completely detached from emotions. This is an unemotional person. He's a strange breed because he has no emotions. You know what? His experience in prison and everything he went through turned him into this cold, hard rock. He's unmoved. He became into power. And people like that, they don't allow their emotions to affect them in any type of way. And that's why he responds the way he responds. He's just a brain power person now. He no longer has heart and emotion. You know, you also have many Holocaust survivors. If you're from a family whose parents or grandparents were survivors, you know it was very hard to get them to talk about the Holocaust. They closed it, they shut it down, and they never responded about it with great emotion because they just didn't want to touch it. So they literally put it in this locked box and wouldn't allow that emotion to get in the way of their lives. For them, it was the only way to survive. So it wasn't that they were not emotional people. Perhaps the very opposite. They were afraid of their emotions. So people will try to analyze Joseph and say he was afraid to allow his emotions to surface. And so we don't find him expressing anger, bitterness. None of that comes through. The problem with that interpretation is if you studied the prior chapters, you would know that that is so wrong. He is the most emotional character in the Bible. He cries more than any biblical character. The verses that we read, Joseph couldn't control his emotions. Joseph couldn't control his tears. Joseph couldn't stop himself from crying. Joseph had to run out of the room because he couldn't hold back the tears. He's not an unemotional fellow. He's quite emotional. Nobody in the Bible is portrayed as vulnerable as Joseph. And that's not a negative thing. It's just the reality of who he was. We watched him, if you followed along on all the classes that we discussed him, excessively crying 8 different times. And yet, throughout the entire story, although he clearly has a plan in mind, we see he's thinking this through of what's he going to do with his brothers and how he's going to react to them. But what we don't find in any of the other narrative of the story of Joseph, that this is an individual who's a rough, cold, hateful human being. You can't say that about him. Quite the contrary. Any of the stories we spoke about Joseph in prison, Joseph in Potiphar's house, what did you find him to be? He was delightful. He was quite charming. He was friendly. He cared about others. He was inspiring. He seemed to love life. He was honorable. He tells Potiphar's wife, hey, I know what I want, but at the same time, it's wrong. I can't have it. I work for your husband. He's been nice to me. We find a very emotional, well thought out person who even in prison loves life. When he says to the 2 fellows, why do you look so troubled today? Remember, all of these parts of the story is painting the narrative of who Joseph is. So he's not a cold person. He's quite emotional. He's not framed with bitterness and hate and anger as we would expect someone who went through the trauma that he went through. So how does he do it? And the story of Joseph, like all of the stories we have picked to discuss in biblical reflections, and I call it in the subtitle, Finding Yourself in the Stories of Genesis. So the real question of this entire course when we study Joseph is, what about Joseph? What can we learn from Joseph? From any injustice or trauma that we went through in life, to have it so that we can still come out and we can still in some type of way go on with our lives. How does he do it? How did he do it? It's a powerful, powerful story and a powerful, powerful example. So let's take a look. Let's take a closer look here at Joseph and how he responds and what's his secret here of how he's able to go on with his life. You know, how we tell a story, the words we choose when we tell a story, when we tell a narrative, determines the meaning of that story for us. The same exact story can be told by two people in two ways, and the story becomes different for each of them. Think about it. The facts can remain exactly the same, but the way they experience it, the way they internalize the very same facts, the way they interpret the very same facts, varies on the words that they use to describe the narrative. There is today a very popular school of psychology known as narrative therapy. What does narrative therapy mean? It helps a patient create a narrative out of his or her life experiences which help them remove the focus from the negative occurrences. So tell the story about your life, but tell it using a narrative that takes the focus off the negative. Tell your story, but choose the words carefully. Because how you tell your story will affect how you go forward in your own life after experiencing that narrative. Joseph, who became his own therapist, took all of his experiences and he tells the story. He tells the story, and he tells it a little bit differently than we might tell it. And we're going to pay close attention to Joseph's words and see exactly what he did and how he survived. And for him, it was healing and it was very empowering. What does Joseph say to his brothers? And really, you can look at one word that changes everything. And this one change of a word, it alters the entire story for him. He takes this disastrous episode and he changes it in the narrative and he gives it a whole different meaning. Okay, what happened to Joseph? What was the most defining story of his life? Okay, if we had to say what was, he was sold as a slave. That's a fact. We can't take away facts. If we're going to do this narrative therapy, what we can't do is lie. We can't make believe something didn't happen. It happened. He was sold as a slave. So now let's listen to Joseph tell the narrative. He changes one word to describe the very same facts. He says to his brothers, "Now be not distressed, nor reproach yourself for having sold me here. For it was to preserve life that God sent me ahead of you." That God sent me ahead of you. Do you see what he did? He's not denying that the brothers sold him, but his narrative is, God sent me. That changes everything for him. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival in the land and to sustain you for a momentous deliverance. It's not you who sent me here, but God. God made me the prime minister here for Pharaoh. God made me the second most powerful person on the face of the earth. This was God's plan, not your plan. You didn't do this to me. You can't take credit for me being the viceroy. God sent me here. One word changes everything in the narrative. You, to the brothers, sold me, but God sent me. You might think that you sold me and made me a slave, but in truth, God had other intentions. God sent me here. And that changes everything for him. Because when you're sold, you're a passive victim. Slaves are sold. Houses are sold. Companies are sold. Objects are sold. Paintings are sold. It happens to you. The object moves from one ownership to another. You don't have a say. But when you're sent, you're an active participant. When you're sent, you were handpicked. You were chosen to be sent somewhere. You possess a particular resource, a particular skill, a particular wisdom, a particular personality and characteristic that God selected you to fulfill a particular mission, and that's why he sent you. That's what Joseph told himself. That's how Joseph interpreted his life. So when he arrives at Potiphar's house, right after his brothers sell him as a slave, yes, that ordeal being sold was traumatic for him. It was painful for him. It was hurtful. But the moment that caravan leaves the scene, the Torah hints to it by telling us, and the caravan was filled with fine fragrance and spices. Every story of the Bible that we have studied, the Torah drops these little words at us, and it's driving the narrative by telling us that the caravan was filled with fragrance, with good spices, with perfumes. It's telling us that the narrative of Joseph is changing, and he's no longer feeling the trauma of what just took place. But suddenly there's perfume that smells well. If I'm being sent here by God, there's a reason. I end up in Potiphar's house. There's a reason. I'm meant to be here. This is where I need to be. As it turns out, he will marry Potiphar's daughter. As it turns out, the story will unfold, starting with the story of Potiphar, and then prison, and then on to make Joseph who he was. Joseph was being sent. Joseph knew he's on a mission. Joseph is on this roller coaster ride filled with excitement every day. Sometimes it's going up, sometimes it's going down, but he's the guy with his hands up, with the smile on his face, screaming as the roller coaster is going how much he loves the ride. That's how he changes the narrative. Did Joseph feel pain? Yes. He was a human. Did Joseph cry? Yes. Did Joseph despair? No. Was he paralyzed? No. Did he allow the trauma to overtake him? No. He never allowed himself to be the victim of his circumstances. He was no victim. He was a messenger. Think about that, how we can use that therapy of Joseph in our own lives and our own experiences when things don't go well. If we're truly able to tune into this, that God runs the world and there's a map for our lives, and for whatever reason that I may not understand, that felt traumatic going through it, but I'm going somewhere. There's a path for me. There's a journey for me. Somewhere this is going to take me where I need to be. As strange as the curveballs of Joseph's lives that he faced, Joseph protected himself from the pain with the awareness that God sent him wherever he was in order to fulfill a mission. So whether he's in a pit, or he's a slave, or he's a prisoner, he was God's ambassador there. He was chosen by God to accomplish something in each of these circumstances. And when he became the most powerful person in the world, he still felt the same. There's a reason. He didn't allow it to get to him. He didn't allow the ego of the office to get to him. He was a messenger of God. The circumstances may have changed. The software was different. But the hardware of his life remained the same throughout all of his years of experiences. He was a shliach. He was an emissary. He was an ambassador of God. Each life, everyone, we each have struggles. Many of us have been hurt, sometimes badly. The facts cannot always be changed. But the way we tell that story can make all the difference. Our versions of our lives' narratives determine our perception of what happened to us and what to do with it. So this is the story of Joseph, is really one of the most powerful therapy sessions that we can go through. Live the story through the eyes of Joseph. Live it with him. Follow his lead. And now change the details of his story to the story of your life. Just like Joseph, we were all in a pit at some point in our life. Just like Joseph, we all felt sold as a slave at some point in our life. Just like Joseph, we felt injustice was done to us, at times by people that we love the most. Just like Joseph, we all spend some time in some sort of prison, one type of prison or another, enslaved, locked up, our free will taken away from us. But it's up to us to decide whether we have been sold into these situations or we were sent there. To bring healing to ourselves, to bring healing to the world around us, to bring light to a place of darkness, to fulfill the purpose of God's existence. We were sent. You know, if someone signs up for a mission, if they belong to, whether it's the CIA or wherever it may be, into going on difficult missions for your country, you don't expect it to be easy. And you know there's going to be some difficult times there, but you are convinced that you're doing it for your country, that it's a mission that's worthwhile, that it's a cause that's worthwhile. Well, whether we signed up or we were drafted into being the chosen people, that's what comes along with it. It's not always going to be easy. But we were sent, not sold. People may have hurt us, situations may have disappointed us, circumstances may have been unfair. But remember what Joseph says. It's not you who sent me here, but God. It's not the people, the events, the circumstances that created a dark world where there is always potential danger. It's God that created it. No one sold you anywhere. God sent you to many interesting places because you are empowered to fulfill your special mission over there. Okay, let's move on in the story. We're going to jump to verse number 15. And he kissed all of his brothers, and he wept over them, and afterwards his brothers spoke with him. So now all this time they're standing there in total silence, and finally after all of this they can speak, which means they were in a total state of shock. And the voice was heard in Pharaoh's house saying, Joseph's brothers have come, and it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, tell your brothers, do this, load up your beasts and go enter the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Now it's interesting, in verse 17 and verse 18, Pharaoh is showing a lot of respect. I'm going to give your family the best of the land of Egypt. I'll take care of them. Please tell them to come and be the guests of the king. But what's interesting, if you look at verse 17 and 18, is what he does not say. He says, tell your brothers, do this. What should have he said? He should have said, Joseph, this is your father. You haven't seen him in so many years. Go and get your father, which means you go and bring your father here. He doesn't say that. He says, tell your brothers to go, implying you stay here. Why? Well, Pharaoh was a smart man. Pharaoh doesn't want to lose Joseph. Joseph saved the country. He doesn't want to risk losing him. If he tells Joseph to go and be honorable and show respect to his father by being the one to visit his father, the fear that Pharaoh has is that Jacob convinces Joseph to stay home. Why are you going to move to Egypt? Stay here. You're alive. Stay with me here. Don't go back. And Pharaoh can't afford losing Joseph. So, Joseph, you stay here. You got a job to do. You're the prime minister. You can't leave. But tell your brothers to go. Verse 19. And you, Joseph, have been commanded to tell them, do this, take yourselves wagons from the land of Egypt for your young children and for your wives, and you shall carry your father and come. So he sends the royal chariots to pick up the family. And let your eye not be concerned about your utensils. Don't worry about packing. I'll take care of anything you need, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. You don't have to put anything in boxes and suitcases. Just go into the royal chariots that I'm sending your way and bring the whole family here. Leave your possessions behind, because you're not going to have to worry about anything. I'm going to take care of you. Verse 21. And the sons of Israel did so. And Joseph gave them wagons by Pharaoh's orders, and he gave them provisions for the way. He gave all of them to each one several changes of clothes, and to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of clothes. And to his father he sent the following: 10 he-donkeys carrying the best of Egypt, and 10 she-donkeys carrying grain, bread, and other food for his father for the way. And he sent off his brothers, and they went, and he said to them, do not quarrel on the way. Very interesting, verse 24, no? No fighting on the way. Just go and do what I'm asking you to do. What does he tell them? Not to fight. Because he knows what they're going to do. It was your fault, Reuven. It was your fault, Shimon. No, you did this. You did this. How come we thought this way about Joseph? It was your fault. They would stop pointing fingers. And so he instructs them. No discussion on the way as to what happened to me. It's a very interesting question, and I don't have an answer for you. I just have a question for you. And the question I ask is, as we will get very soon to the reunion of Joseph and Jacob, father and son, we will never find in the text of the Torah something that we think would be glaring. And that would be, and Jacob says to his son Joseph, what happened? That's simple. What happened to you? Where were you for 22 years? How did you get to Egypt? Isn't it interesting that for the rest of the book of Genesis, all the discussions between Jacob and Joseph will never have that question of Jacob asking Joseph, what happened? Imagine. Father can't find his son for 22 years, and finally he's found in another country. Don't you think you're going to ask, hey, how did you get there? And we never find a discussion. And so the question is, did they ever have that discussion? Perhaps it just wasn't recorded, or did they never have that discussion? Did Jacob not want to know? Did Joseph not want to talk about it? You see that alluded to in verse 24 when he's already shutting down the discussion to his brothers. No quarreling, no arguing as to how this happened. Verse 25. So they went up from Egypt, and they came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. And he told them, saying, Joseph is still alive. And they told him that he ruled over the entire land of Egypt. And his heart changed, for he did not believe them. There's a beautiful commentary on verse 26. That the brothers were concerned on their way back how they're going to break the news to their father Jacob that Joseph is alive. Not just were they concerned that the father's going to say, what do you mean he's alive? So you guys, how'd you get that coat with many colors dipped in blood? Did you play a part in this? So besides for them being concerned about their father asking them questions, they were concerned about another thing. He's an elderly man. Will he be able to receive such news and survive? Will he have a heart attack because he hears such a shocking, even if it's good news? And so they actually came up with a beautiful plan. One of the brothers, Asher, had a daughter named Serach. Serach played the harp and had a beautiful voice. She loved singing, and she would very often play the harp for her grandfather and sing to him. So they brought Serach out before they came into the house, and they told Serach, we need you to write a song. And in the song say, the chorus of the song should be, Joseph is still alive. Od Yosef Chai. Write a song called Od Yosef Chai. And go into Grandpa, go to Zaidi, play your harp, and sing the song. And just keep singing Od Yosef Chai. Yosef still lives. Yosef still lives. So just that the words will start penetrating. That it's a song of prayer, a song of hope that Joseph is still alive. But that way it will soften it. And that's what she did. And it worked perfectly. That as she continued to sing over and over the words Od Yosef Chai, his emunah, his faith strengthened, indeed that his son was still alive. And the more his faith strengthened, the more he started receiving back this vision of being able to see things throughout the rest of the world that he wasn't able to see for the last 22 years. And when that took place, he then knows Joseph's alive. Verse 27, and they told him all of Joseph's words that he had said to them. And then he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him. These are royal chariots. They got the king's, Pharaoh's insignia on it. And the spirit of their father was revived. He's alive again. And Israel said, enough. My son Joseph is still alive. Enough mourning. Enough sadness. Joseph is alive. I will go and I will see him before I die. Notice his name changes in the beginning of verse 28, and Israel, all along he's Jacob, and now he goes back to being Israel. This tells us that between verse 27 and 28, that spirit came back to him. Israel is the higher name. Israel is the name that talks about him as the leader, as the prophet. And suddenly he's back to being prophet. His son Joseph's alive. Jumping to the next chapter, and in this chapter we're just going to jump around to a few key verses. Verse 1, and Israel and all that was his set out and came to Beersheba. He's traveling now from his home down to Egypt. He slaughtered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. He's bringing a tribute to God for this good news. And God says to Israel in visions of the night, God speaks to him, first time in 22 years that God spoke to him again. And he said, Jacob, Jacob. And he answered, Hineni, here I am. And he said, I am the God of your father. Don't be afraid of going down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I'll also bring you up. And Joseph will place his hands on your eyes, which means Joseph will be by your side for every day of the rest of your life. And Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father and their young children and their wives in the wagons Pharaoh had sent to carry him. Verse 6, and they took their livestock and their possessions that they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and they came to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him. His sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. Jumping to the end of the chapter, verse 29. And Joseph harnessed his chariot, and he went up to meet Israel his father to Goshen. And he appeared to him, and he fell on his neck, and he wept on his neck for a very long time. Verse 30. And Israel said to Joseph, I will die this time, meaning it's okay if I died right now, since I've seen your face, that you're still alive. My life is fulfilled. My life, I'm fine. I'm fine with everything I've been through. because I've seen your face. Very touching, very moving, very dramatic end to this particular story of the Bible. I just want to conclude with something I spoke about in class this afternoon. So if you were with me this afternoon, forgive me for repeating just part of it. And with this, I'll conclude the story of Joseph and his brothers. This meeting of the two, especially if you've been studying the story of Joseph all along, from the past semester, this semester, there's a lot of emotions that we feel during this story. A lot of feelings that we have, but clearly the bond that's here in the story is Jacob and Joseph, father and son. We know how close they are. We know how Jacob made him that coat. We know of the love. We know of the pain. We know of the mourning. There's so much power and drama in the relationship here between this father and son that as they get together and they reunite, you feel it. Even if you study the story of Joseph each and every single year as we go through the Torah cycle, every time we get to it, there's still something there, still something that we feel. And yet that last verse, that 29, was a little bit strange. Because the verse said that Joseph fell on his father's neck and cried, and then it says, and then he cried some more. And what you didn't have in that verse was any mention of Jacob crying on Joseph. We find later he says, now I can die because I've seen your face. But when they first met, that first hug, the Torah only writes it one way. Joseph hugged his father. Joseph fell on his father's neck. Joseph cried on his father, and Joseph cried some more on his father. Nowhere do you find Jacob responding. And Jacob cried on his father. You imagine 22 years thinking that he's dead. 22 years thinking your son is dead and you find out he's alive, and the first time you see him, how could there not be that emotional outbreak in that verse? And Rashi, the commentary, tells us that there's a reason for it. That the reason there's no mention of Jacob embracing his son at that time was because he was very busy. What was he very busy doing? He was in the middle of reciting the Shema. He was saying, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. He was praying to God at that very moment, and therefore he couldn't participate in this hugging and crying and kissing. As I mentioned earlier today in our class on the Shema, the commentary, if you think about it, makes absolutely no sense. Because if Jacob was busy praying, obviously he could have prayed an hour ago, he could have prayed 2 hours ago, or he could have prayed an hour later. This moment of this reunion, certainly God would have understood if he didn't pray at that very moment. Kiss your son, you haven't seen him for 22 years. Cry on your son, you haven't seen him for 22 years, you thought he was dead. Especially a man like Jacob who's been through so much pain. And he alludes to that in verse 30. Now I can die. At least I've seen your face. Certainly such a man deserves this reunion time, this joyful time, where you can celebrate the reunion. Certainly God would have forgiven him if he didn't say the Shema at that very moment. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any logical sense. Unless it's exactly what Jacob is trying to tell us. You see, there are two types of love. There's love for the moment, and there's eternal love. Love for the moment, you feel an emotion, and you express that emotion. It's real. Has passion, you act upon it, a hug, an embrace, a kiss, and then life moves on. Jacob was experiencing something that was so deep the joy that you can't get any higher in height to this joy, that he wanted to bottle this moment to make sure that this moment and this love that he was feeling is something that lives on forever. This should not be a feeling, an emotion that just goes on for 5 minutes and then we move on with life. This has to be something so strong and so powerful that it stays forever. And the only way he can do that is if he connects this moment with something that's forever, namely something that's infinite, namely God. If he can take this moment and devote it to God and yell out, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, at this greatest moment of existence, then that moment becomes something that will live on forever. Not just live on forever for him, but live on forever for Joseph. For every time he will say the word Shema, he will remember this reunion. Live on forever in their children, in their descendants, that every time we say the Shema, we will think of that moment of embrace of the two of them and the power of that moment and what that moment meant to someone like a Joseph and someone like a Jacob and what they both lived through. And to have them come together, the only way to solidify it and bottle that energy was at that very moment. To go beyond the physical desire to embrace and hug and kiss your son and to say, stop a moment. This is a moment of infinite power, of infinite passion. This is a moment of God. This is a godly moment. Certainly after this, he kissed his son, he embraced his son, he hugged his son, he cried on his son. Absolutely. But at that very first instant, what was he thinking? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And decades later, when Joseph was no longer with his father, for his father had passed on, and he wanted to feel his father's love, all he will have to do is put his hand over his eyes and say the Shema, and he would relive that moment. And when generations would pass, and exile would begin, and the Jewish people would be thrown out of the land of Israel and scattered to all corners of the world, and struggle, and live the life of Jacob in this world experience of feeling the pain that Jacob felt, and still struggling to go on as a Jew, as a member of the chosen people. How will we survive? We'll place our hands over our eyes and we will say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And we'll tune into that very powerful moment of the reunion of Jacob and Joseph. The reunion of the family, the reunion of the Jewish people. It's only after this story comes to a conclusion that we can now move on to becoming a nation. Until the family of Jacob got their act together, reunited, understood the value of brothers and sisters, the value of family, the unity of family, we can't begin to be a nation. We can't influence a world. We can't be a light unto the nations. First, the family must be strong. And now that the family is reunited, yes, they're going into exile into Egypt, but so long as the family is united and solidified, we could begin the discussion of being that chosen people, of being God's nation, of going out into the world and influencing a world until we fulfill our ultimate mission, the mission of the Jewish people, to bring Mashiach, to bring the Messiah to all of the world and free the world of all pain, of all suffering, of all war. Especially at a time like this that we're all, the world is shaking as to what is going on in Russia and Ukraine at that particular border. God should watch over his world, protect his world, and we should be successful in bringing the ultimate redemption to the world, the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, which should happen speedily in our days. Thank you all so much for joining me for this course. I look forward to other biblical courses to doing together with you, some on Zoom, but hopefully one of these days back in person where we get to see one another, interact with one another. Take care, everyone.